There's a wooden fence on a completely ordinary street, beige houses on both sides, a basketball hoop with a flat tire leaning against a garage, a dog barking 2 doors down. If you walked past it on a Tuesday afternoon, you wouldn't look twice. Behind that fence is a business that made $6,000 last month. No employees, no warehouse, no land beyond the backyard that came with the house when he bought it. Just under 400 square feet, a converted shed, and one person who has never once had to hire anybody to help him run it. Before we go any further, I want to be upfront about something because I think it matters more than the number does. This is not a story about getting rich overnight. $6,000 a month after costs is a strong income. It is not quit your life and buy a boat money. But it's real, it's repeatable, and it didn't require an acre of land, a business loan, or a single employee ever showing up to punch a clock. What's actually happening inside that shed is the part almost nobody guesses correctly. I showed this setup to 6 different people before making this video, cold, with no context, and every single one of them guessed wrong. Chickens, rabbits. One person half joked it was a grow-op. Another guessed worms, another guessed a woodworking side hustle, and one person, standing right in front of the shed door, guessed it was just storage for pool equipment. Nobody guessed right, not even close, and that gap between what it looks like from the outside and what it actually is turns out to be a big part of why this works at all. So here's what we're going to do. I'm going to walk you through exactly what's inside that shed, exactly what it costs to build, exactly what it earns, and what it costs to run every single month. The real numbers, not the rounded up best month numbers, and exactly what almost made this whole thing fail back in month 4. Stay with me for that part especially, because it's the part most people like this one skip over entirely, and it's the part that actually matters if you're ever thinking about trying something like this yourself. But first, a little context on how somebody ends up building a $6,000 a month business in a backyard shed in the first place. Because the answer isn't, he had a green thumb. The answer starts somewhere a lot less pleasant. 3 years ago, the man behind that fence, we'll call him Daniel since he'd rather not use his last name on camera, was laid off from a logistics job he'd held for 11 years. Not because he was bad at it. The regional warehouse he worked at closed entirely, and 340 people got the same letter on the same Tuesday morning. He had 4 months of severance, a mortgage, 2 kids, and a backyard that, up until that point, had never grown anything more ambitious than a tomato plant that died every August like clockwork. His wife, Melissa, works part-time as a dental hygienist, enough to cover roughly a third of the household's fixed costs, which meant the severance clock was the real deadline, not an abstract one. Daniel told me they sat down in week 2 and mapped out exactly how many months they had before they'd need to seriously consider selling the house. And that number, 5 months, with almost no cushion beyond it, sat in the back of his mind through the entire $40 test, the $11 first sale, and the decision to spend $2,000 building the shed. He wasn't experimenting from a place of comfort. He was experimenting because the alternative at that point was running out of better options. Here's the thing nobody tells you about a layoff like that. The panic isn't really about the money running out. It's about having absolutely no plan. Daniel sent out over 200 job applications in the first 6 weeks. 2 callbacks, 0 offers. In between applications, he tried a couple of things to bridge the gap. A few weeks of rideshare driving, which he said barely covered gas and wear on the car once he actually tracked it honestly, and a short stretch reselling clearance furniture he'd find at big box stores, which made a little money but ate entire weekends driving a rented truck around town. Neither of those felt like a direction. They felt like treading water. And somewhere around week 7, sitting in his kitchen at 11 at night scrolling job boards out of habit more than hope, he came across a video, not unlike this one, about someone growing a niche crop in a small space and selling it locally for far more than he expected something like that could possibly be worth. He didn't believe the numbers in that video. He told me that directly. I thought it was fake, or at best, somebody's one good month dressed up as a normal month. So he did something most people watching a video like that never actually do. He didn't buy a course. He didn't join an online group and start asking strangers for advice. He spent $40 on materials and tried to replicate a tiny version of it himself in his garage, just to see if the basic premise was even true before he risked anything real. That $40 test is where this actually starts, not the shed, not the $6,000. A $40 test on a garage shelf with a thermometer from the dollar store and a humidity gauge he'd bought years earlier for cigars he no longer smoked. And what happened with that first test is honestly the reason the rest of this story exists at all. Oyster mushrooms. That's the secret behind the fence. Not an exotic strain. Not a patented method. Not some rare cultivar you've never heard of. Oyster mushrooms. The same kind you can buy in almost any grocery store produce aisle for a few dollars a package, grown at a scale and a level of consistency that most home growers never bother reaching. Here's why that first garage test mattered so much. Oyster mushrooms are forgiving, but they are not free money. They're sensitive to exact humidity, exact airflow, exact temperature swings, and if you get any one of those wrong at scale, you don't just get a smaller harvest, you get a moldy, unsellable one. Daniel's $40 test wasn't about proving mushrooms could grow. Everybody already knows mushrooms can grow. It was about proving that he, personally, with no background in this at all, could keep the conditions consistent enough in his own climate to make it worth the investment of an actual structure. The test worked. 3 flushes off 1 bag of substrate, sold informally to 2 neighbors and a coworker from his old job for $11 total. $11 does not sound like the beginning of a $6,000 a month business, but it told him something a spreadsheet never could. The biology worked in his specific garage with his specific climate, using tools he could afford on almost no budget at all. He remembers standing in the garage that first week, checking the bag every few hours out of pure nervousness, half convinced he'd come out one morning and find nothing but mold. When the first pins actually appeared, the small early clusters that eventually open into full oyster mushrooms, he said it was one of the only genuinely good moments in an otherwise rough stretch of that year. What surprised him more than the mushrooms actually fruiting was how the neighbors reacted. One of them, an older woman 2 houses down, asked if he'd have more the following week before he'd even mentioned selling anything again. The coworker, who'd tried grocery store oyster mushrooms exactly once and hadn't liked the texture, said these were noticeably different, firmer, less watery, and asked what he was doing differently. He wasn't doing anything exotic. He just wasn't shipping them across the country in a plastic clamshell first. So he took that $11, added some of what was left of his severance, and made a decision a lot of people in his position wouldn't have made. Instead of trying to scale up inside the garage, he built something purpose-made. A 10 by 12 shed in the back corner of the yard, insulated with a single mini-split unit, a humidifier, and shelving he built himself out of pressure-treated lumber and plastic sheeting. Total cost to build it out, start to finish, materials only, no paid labor, $2,140. That number is going to matter a lot in a few minutes when we get into the real profit math. But first, let's actually walk through how the thing works day to day, because a shed full of mushrooms doesn't explain how one person with no employees keeps 400 square feet producing on a tight enough schedule to hit $6,000 a month, not just in one lucky harvest, but consistently. Here's the full daily rhythm, because this is the part people always assume is more complicated than it actually is. First, the substrate. Daniel doesn't grow from scratch, from raw straw or sawdust, the way a lot of hobbyists do. He buys pre-inoculated grow bags from a regional supplier 2 hours away, in bulk, roughly every 10 days. That single decision, in his words, is the reason he doesn't need employees. Making substrate from scratch is the most labor-intensive, most failure-prone part of mushroom cultivation. Outsourcing it to a supplier who does it at a much larger scale, with better equipment than he could ever afford on his own, means his own daily labor is almost entirely about managing the environment, not managing production. That supplier relationship took some trial and error of its own. His first supplier, a smaller operation an hour closer to home, had inconsistent inoculation rates. Some bags fruited beautifully, others barely produced at all, and there was no way to tell which was which until it was too late to do anything about it. Daniel switched suppliers after his third order, adding an extra hour each way to the pickup drive, in exchange for a consistency that made the rest of his operation predictable enough to actually plan around. He still makes that 4-hour round trip himself, roughly every 10 days rather than paying for delivery, because the cost of delivery would eat meaningfully into the margin on a business already running lean. Second, the shed itself does most of the daily work. The mini-split holds the temperature in a tight band. A humidifier on a timer keeps moisture where the mushrooms need it. A small fan runs on a cycle to manage carbon dioxide buildup, because oyster mushrooms without enough fresh air exchange grow long and spindly instead of the compact sellable shape that restaurants and grocers actually want to buy. Third, harvesting. Bags, fruit, and flushes. Waves, essentially. Usually 2 to 3 flushes per bag before it's spent. Daniel checks the shed twice a day, roughly 20 minutes each visit, morning and evening. Harvesting itself, when a flush is ready, takes another hour or two, a few times a week. By his own estimate, total hands-on time across the entire operation runs 8 to 11 hours a week. That number wasn't true from day one, though. In the first 2 months in the actual shed, before he'd learned to read the signs properly, he missed the ideal harvest window twice, letting caps open further than restaurants want, which meant selling that batch at a lower price to the co-op instead of at the better restaurant rate. He also overcorrected on humidity early on, running it too high, which invited exactly the kind of contamination risk that would catch up with him later. Both mistakes were small on their own. Neither one threatened the business by itself. But they were the first signs of how unforgiving the margins could be if the environment drifted even slightly out of range. Fourth, and this is the part that actually took him the longest to figure out, is where the mushrooms actually go after harvest. Because growing them was never the hard part. Selling 400 square feet worth of oyster mushrooms consistently, every single week, without it turning into a part-time job standing behind a table. That's where almost every backyard grower like this actually stalls out. Not in the growing, in the selling. And Daniel's answer to that problem is honestly the most useful, most repeatable part of this entire story. He does not sell at a farmer's market. He tried it for 6 weeks early on, and by his own account, lost money doing it once you account for his time. Standing at a table for 5 hours on a Saturday to sell $90 of mushrooms isn't a business. It's a hobby with a cash register attached. What he does instead is almost entirely wholesale to 3 types of buyers. 2 independent restaurants who take a standing weekly order because oyster mushrooms hold up well in a kitchen, and their chefs like having one consistent, reliable supplier. 1 small local grocery co-op, which takes whatever surplus is left over after the restaurant orders at a lower price per pound but guaranteed and in bulk, and a short list of regular households, about 14 of them, who get a text message every time there's a fresh harvest and buy directly at the highest price per pound of any of his 3 channels, because they're paying for freshness and convenience, not just for mushrooms. That text message list is the detail almost nobody copies, and it's arguably the most valuable part of the whole system. 14 households is nothing. It sounds like nothing. But those 14 households buy at nearly double the price per pound that the grocery co-op pays, because Daniel isn't competing on price with anybody else. He's the only person texting them the moment fresh oyster mushrooms are ready, 10 minutes from their front door. That list took him almost a full year to build, 1 household at a time, mostly through word of mouth from the first few neighbors who bought from that very first $40 garage test, which means the smallest, least impressive part of this entire story, 2 neighbors and a coworker, $11, never actually stopped mattering. It became the seed of his single highest margin sales channel. The first restaurant account came from a fairly unglamorous approach too. Daniel didn't cold call anywhere. He walked into a restaurant near his old warehouse job with a single 1-pound bag, no pitch prepared, and asked to speak to whoever did the ordering. The chef happened to be in that afternoon, tried a handful raw out of curiosity, and asked what the price would be for a standing weekly order before Daniel had even finished explaining where they came from. The second restaurant came 6 months later through a referral from the first chef, who mentioned Daniel's mushrooms to a friend who ran a smaller place 2 towns over. Neither relationship involved a formal sales pitch, a website, or a single dollar spent on advertising. It was a bag of mushrooms and a conversation, twice, roughly 6 months apart. Before we get to the money, there's a question I know a lot of you are already asking because it's the first thing almost everyone asks when they hear backyard business. What about the neighbors? And what about the rules? Daniel checked before he built anything. His city's zoning code allows a home occupation as long as it doesn't involve retail foot traffic, doesn't generate commercial level noise, and doesn't require parking beyond what the property already has. Since every sale happens off-site, delivered to restaurants, dropped at the co-op, or handed directly to a household on a pre-arranged pickup, there's no customer ever pulling into his driveway, no sign on the fence, nothing that would visually announce a business is running back there at all. That's not a loophole he found by accident. It's the reason the sales system is built the way it is. As for smell, it's a fair question, and the honest answer is that oyster mushroom cultivation is far less pungent than most people assume. There's an earthy smell inside the shed itself, mild and not unpleasant, but the insulation and the fact that the door stays closed except for 2 short visits a day means it's essentially undetectable from the yard, let alone from a neighboring property. In 3 years, Daniel has had exactly 1 comment from a neighbor about the shed, and it wasn't about smell. It was someone asking if he'd finally finished building that workshop. Okay, sales channels, production system, all explained. Now let's actually do the math in full, because this is exactly where most videos about backyard businesses quietly go vague, and I don't want to do that to you. Let's start with revenue on an average month, not his best month, not his worst, his average one. Restaurant wholesale brings in roughly $2,600 a month split across the 2 accounts. Grocery co-op surplus brings in about $1,150 a month, and this one swings the most, since it depends entirely on what's left over after the restaurant orders are filled. Direct household sales, the text message list, bring in around $1,900 a month on the smallest volume of the 3 channels, but by far the highest margin. Total average monthly revenue, $5,650. Now the costs. Substrate bags, his single largest recurring expense, run about $1,050 a month. Electricity for the mini split, the humidifier, and the fans, which he tracks separately on a submeter specifically so he'd have a real number instead of a guess, comes to about $310 a month. Packaging, bags, labels, the small stuff, runs about $85 a month. And a rough monthly allocation for the shed's original build costs spread over 5 years, which is roughly how long he expects the structure to hold up before any major repairs, comes to about $36 a month. Total monthly costs, $1,481. Net profit, average month, $4,169. Now, you'll notice that's not $6,000. And I want to be straight with you about that, because the title of this video says $6,000, and the honest average month is closer to $4,170. The $6,000 figure is real. It's his best month on record, from a stretch last spring when both restaurants increased their standing orders around the same time, and the co-op took an unusually large surplus order for a catering event. It happened. It isn't made up, but it's the ceiling, not the floor. And I don't think a video that only shows you the ceiling is actually useful to you if you're ever considering trying something like this yourself. So, $4,000 to $6,000 a month, depending on the season and order volume, on roughly 10 hours a week of hands-on labor out of a 400 square foot shed that cost just over $2,000 to build. No employees, no land beyond the yard he already owned. It's also worth being honest about how much the seasons move that number around, because a lot of videos in this genre quietly smooth that detail out too. Summer is the hardest stretch. The mini split has to work considerably harder to hold the shed's internal temperature down against outside heat, which shows up directly in the electricity bill, closer to $440 in July and August, compared to the $200 range in spring and fall. Winter brings a different problem. The restaurant's order volume dips slightly in January and February, for reasons that have nothing to do with Daniel, and everything to do with slower dining traffic after the holidays. Between the two effects, his actual lowest month of the year, typically February, nets closer to $3,400, while his highest months cluster in April, May, and October, when demand is up and utility costs are down at the same time. The $6,000 month you saw at the start of this video happened to land in that window. That's the good version of this story. Now let's talk about month 4, when a single mistake almost ended the whole thing before it ever got this far. In month 4, before any of the restaurant accounts existed, before the text list had more than 4 households on it, Daniel lost almost an entire month of production to green mold contamination. Trichoderma, green mold, is one of the most common threats in any small-scale mushroom operation, and it spreads fast. It got into 6 of his active bags within the same week, and rather than isolating them immediately, he kept them in the shed alongside the healthy bags for 2 extra days, hoping it was something else, hoping he was wrong. He wasn't. By the time he finally pulled the contaminated bags, spores had already spread through the shed's air, and within another 10 days, 11 of his 14 active bags were unsellable. That's not a small setback. That's close to an entire month's inventory at a point in the business where he had no savings cushion left from the severance, 2 restaurant accounts he'd only just signed and now couldn't supply, and a mortgage payment due in 9 days. He told me directly that this was the closest he came to quitting. Not because the mushrooms had failed, but because he seriously considered whether the entire premise might not be reliable enough to depend on for a mortgage payment, ever, and whether continuing to pour time and the last of his savings into it might simply be the wrong call. What actually got him through it wasn't a clever fix. It was unglamorous. He called both restaurants, explained exactly what had happened, offered a discount on the next order to make up for the gap, and neither of them dropped him, because up to that point his deliveries had been reliable and on time every single week, and that track record bought him the benefit of the doubt during the 1 week he actually needed it. He also rebuilt his entire sanitation process from scratch after that. A stricter isolation protocol for new bags, a dedicated inspection window every single morning instead of every other day, and a rule he still follows to this day: any bag showing even faint discoloration gets removed from the shed within the hour, no waiting, no hoping he's wrong a second time. That protocol is the reason the operation is run without a repeat contamination event in the 2 years since. Which brings us to the actual point of telling you all of this. Let's go back to that 11 hours a week number from earlier, because I think it's the most important number in this entire video, more than the 4,000 or the 6,000. At his old logistics job, Daniel worked, by his own tracking, close to 48 hours a week once you counted the commute. A 40-hour shift plus a round-trip drive that added almost 8 more hours weekly that nobody paid him for. His annual salary before the layoff was $61,000. Break that down to an hourly rate against actual time spent, including the commute, and it comes to a little under $25 an hour. Now the shed, at an average month of $4,169 in profit against roughly 10 hours a week of hands-on labor, that works out to about $96 an hour. I want to be careful here, because that comparison isn't entirely fair, and Daniel would be the first person to say so. The shed doesn't include benefits. It doesn't include health insurance. It doesn't account for the unpaid time he spent building the sales relationships in year one, and it carries a kind of risk, the mold contamination, a bad month, a lost account, that a salaried job simply doesn't carry. A straight hourly comparison flatters this kind of business in a way that isn't the whole truth, and I don't want to pretend otherwise. But even accounting for all of that, the actual shift in his life is hard to argue with. He's home for both of his kids' bus arrivals every single day, something he almost never managed at the logistics job. He hasn't missed a school event in 2 years, and the ceiling on his income now depends on decisions he makes himself. A third restaurant account, an expanded household list, a second shed, rather than a regional hub deciding, on some random Tuesday, that 340 people are no longer needed. I asked Daniel directly whether he'd ever considered a second shed since the math on the first one clearly works. He has, and he's held off for reasons that are worth walking through because they say a lot about how he actually thinks about this business. A second shed would roughly double his production capacity, but it wouldn't double his revenue because his current buyers, the 2 restaurants, the co-op, and the household list, can only absorb so much volume before he'd need to find entirely new accounts. New restaurant accounts take months to build the kind of trust that got him through the mold crisis, and he's not willing to rush that relationship building just to fill a second shed's capacity. There's also the labor question. Doubling the square footage wouldn't double his 10 hours a week. It would likely push him past 20, at which point he'd either need to hire the first employee he's never had, or accept that his own time, not the shed space, is actually the ceiling on this business. For now, he's chosen to keep it exactly the size it is, and instead spends any spare capacity experimenting with a second variety, Lion's Mane, on a couple of shelves, mostly to see if it's worth adding as a fourth revenue line before committing real space to it. So if you're watching this and wondering whether something like this is realistic for you, here's what I actually think matters, based on everything Daniel told me. This is not a get-rich story, and if that's what you came here for, I'd rather tell you that plainly than let you find out 40 minutes in. What it actually requires, in order, based on how Daniel's first year genuinely went: first, a genuinely cheap test, his was $40, before spending anything real on infrastructure. Not because $40 proves a business works, but because it proves the basic mechanics work in your own space, with your own climate, and with your own patience for daily upkeep, before you risk $2,000 finding that out the hard way. Second, patience with the unglamorous groundwork. In his case, that was the text message list that took most of a year to reach 14 households, and which turned out to be the highest margin channel in the entire operation. The parts of this that built real durable value were almost never the parts that looked impressive from the outside. Third, an actual sanitation and quality protocol before you have any real customers depending on you, not after a contamination event forces you to build one under pressure, with a mortgage payment due in 9 days. And fourth, the one Daniel was most insistent I include, an honest, unglamorous relationship with your buyers. The reason 2 restaurant accounts didn't drop him during his worst month wasn't a clever sales pitch. It was 2 straight months of boring, reliable, on-time deliveries beforehand, and that's not a secret trick. It's not something a shed or a mini split or a supplier can do for you. There are a few other questions people tend to ask when they hear a story like this, and I'd rather answer them here than leave you guessing in the comments. The first is almost always about the kids. 2 young children and a shed full of mushrooms sounds on paper like a safety concern, and Daniel takes it seriously. The shed is kept locked, not out of secrecy, but the same way you'd lock a shed with power tools or chemicals in it. His kids know it's Dad's work shed, the same way they'd understand an office, and neither of them has any particular interest in going inside. It's climate controlled and, according to his 10-year-old, boring, just shelves. The mushrooms themselves aren't dangerous to be around, but the equipment, the mini split, the humidifier's water reservoir, the shelving loaded with bags, is treated the same as any other piece of home infrastructure that isn't a place for unsupervised kids to play. The second question is about startup capital, specifically whether the $2,140 for the shed came from somewhere other than severance, because not everyone has 4 months of a payout sitting in a bank account when they're deciding whether to try something like this. Daniel's honest answer is that the severance mattered, and he doesn't want to pretend it didn't. But he also pointed out that the actual sequence, $40, then $11 in sales, then a slow year of proving the concept before the full shed was built, meant that by the time he spent the $2,000, he already had 11 months of evidence that the biology, the local demand, and his own ability to keep up with it were all real. If you don't have severance sitting around, the sequence still works. It just moves at whatever pace your own available capital allows, and there's no rule that says the shed has to be built in year 1 rather than year 2 or 3. The third question, and probably the most common one, is simply, could this work with a different crop in a different climate for someone who has no interest in mushrooms specifically? Daniel's answer, and mine, is that the mushrooms are almost beside the point. What actually made this work was the sequence. Cheap test, honest evaluation of whether you personally can maintain the conditions required, a slow-built relationship with a small number of high-trust buyers, and a sanitation or quality standard that gets built before a crisis forces it. I asked Daniel near the end of our conversation whether he had any regrets about how any of it went. Whether, knowing what he knows now, he'd have done the $40 test sooner, skipped the 6 weeks at the farmer's market, or handled the mold contamination differently. He thought about it longer than I expected before answering. The farmer's market weeks, he said. He wouldn't skip, even though they lost money, because they're what taught him that his time had a real cost and needed to be treated that way from the start, a lesson that shaped every decision about the wholesale and text message channels that came after. The mold contamination, he said, he genuinely wishes had gone differently, not because of the financial hit, but because those 2 extra days of hoping he was wrong, instead of acting immediately, are the closest this story ever came to not existing at all. If there's a single piece of advice he'd want someone in his position to actually hear, it's that one. The moment you suspect something is wrong in an operation like this is the moment to act, not the moment to wait and see. So if that's something you'd want, say so in the comments, specifically, not just more please, but what part you'd actually want to see built out. That tells me a lot more than a like ever will, and I do read every one of them. If this is the kind of story you want more of, real numbers, real setbacks, not just the highlight reel, subscribing is the best way to make sure the next one actually reaches you, since none of us can count on the algorithm to do that reliably anymore. Thanks for sticking with this one all the way through, from the fence at the very start to this last thought right here.